If we look at the Wikipedia page about the 1972 Democratic primary for president, we see that George McGovern was the winner of the nomination. But we also see this: George Wallace finishing a close third in the popular vote. This begs the question, if Wallace didn't walk in front of Arthur Bremer's bullet in a Maryland parking lot, could Wallace have won the Democratic nomination in 1972? Furthermore, could he have gone on to win the general election against Richard Nixon? In this video, we're going to look at the 1972 Democratic primary season and see if Wallace really had a chance to win it all, even if he hadn't been shot. Also, we'll look at whether he would have performed better against Richard Nixon compared to the eventual Democratic nominee, George McGovern. But before we get into the 1972 season, we first need to take a look at George Wallace himself. He first ran for governor of Alabama in 1958 as what could be considered the moderate candidate. While other Democratic candidates like Attorney General John Patterson and former state Senator Jimmy Faulkner played the race card, Wallace took a more moderate approach in his campaign, saying that he opposed civil rights legislation, but tried to keep the debate within the context of the legislation itself, not making it an issue of race. Wallace was also a close ally to incumbent Governor Big Jim Folsom, who was more moderate on the race issue. With this approach, Wallace was seen as a young and coming face in Alabama politics, finishing both second in the Democratic primary and the runoff. But bitter about his defeat, Wallace decided to take a more hard line on segregation when he decided to run for the same position in 1962. In his 1962 campaign, Big Jim decided to run for governor again. He, along with Ryan D. Graffenreid, captured the moderate vote, making Wallace the only serious candidate who was a conservative on the civil rights and race issue. Wallace would go on to finish first in the primary and the runoff election, becoming the governor in 1963. And during his inaugural address, Wallace famously said,
"In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever."
Now, Wallace was different than other segregationist governors at the time. He was young, charismatic, witty, able to defend his point of view on the turn of a dime, and spoke quite eloquently. It was these characteristics that allowed Wallace to have the national spotlight shone on him. He garnered even more national attention with his stand in front of the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. Essentially, he became the standard bearer of Southern segregationist Democrats on the national stage. Wallace decided to take it one step further, stating that he was considering running for the Democratic nomination for president in 1964 against John F. Kennedy. He made this announcement on November 18, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Yeah, that's just 4 days before Kennedy was assassinated in the same city. Still, once Johnson became president, Wallace kept his pledge to run. He only contested a few primaries, but still he pulled 34% in Wisconsin, 30% in Indiana, and 43% in Maryland, showing that he had appeal and reach beyond the deep Dixie South. After the 1964 election, in which LBJ swept to the largest Democratic electoral landslide in history, Wallace couldn't run for governor of Alabama again due to term limits, even though he tried to change the Alabama Constitution in 1965 to allow him to run, but he failed. Instead, his wife, Lurleen Wallace, ran as his surrogate, even though she had been suffering from cancer and was receiving radiation therapy and going through a lot of pain before and during the campaign. Still, Lurleen easily defeated former governors Patterson and Folsom with 54% of the vote, avoiding a runoff election, but in 1968, Lurleen Wallace succumbed to her illness, and Lieutenant Governor Albert Brewer became governor of Alabama. In 1968, Wallace decided to run for president, taking 46 electoral votes and 13.5% of the popular vote. Interesting, while Wallace ran as a third-party candidate in most states, in Alabama he was actually considered the official Democratic Party of Alabama candidate, requiring Hubert Humphrey and the Democratic National Committee to create a new political party inside of Alabama to allow Humphrey to be on the state's ballot, but that's another video for another day. No longer being term limited, George Wallace decided to run for governor again against incumbent Governor Brewer in 1970. However, the South was starting to see a turning tide as far as gubernatorial candidates. Since the issue of segregation was no longer an issue and black voters had become a strong voting bloc in the South, many Southern gubernatorial candidates thought that creating a voting bloc with the newly enfranchised voters was better than turning them away. Democratic gubernatorial candidates like Reuben Askew in Florida, Dale Bumpers in Arkansas, and John West in South Carolina embraced this trend, ushering in a new progressive era in Southern Democratic politics. However, some candidates continued to play the race card. The first candidate might disappoint you, and even though we know him as the loving former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter's campaign against former Georgia Governor Carl Sanders was pretty bad and had racist overtones. Yeah, that's another video for another day to open up that can of worms, but the other Southern candidate who turned to race, of course, was George Wallace. Now, because segregation was no longer an issue, Wallace decided to just go purely racist in his 1970 campaign. In the past, he tried to look at the issue of race through laws regarding segregation, civil rights, and voting legislation. But in this campaign, he purely came out and said vote for him, or white domination in the state would be over. Look at this mailer that the Wallace campaign sent out. If that doesn't scream racism, I have no idea what does. Anyways, Governor Brewer finished first in the Democratic gubernatorial primary, with Wallace finishing second. This was the first time that a Wallace hadn't finished first place on a statewide ballot since Georgia's defeat against Patterson back in 1958. However, in the runoff, Wallace defeated Brewer by only 2%. But still, the once dominant George Wallace was now starting to show that he was a bit vulnerable. Also during his 1970 campaign, he said he wouldn't run for president in 1972. So yeah, fast forward 14 months later, and here we are in Tallahassee with George Wallace announcing that he would contest the Florida presidential preference primary for the 1972 Democratic presidential nomination. Yeah, that campaign pledge didn't last long. As was mentioned in 1970 gubernatorial race in Alabama, the issue of segregation no longer had national or regional dominance. Instead, Wallace found a new issue to fight for that could retain his Southern support, as well as give him support in the North as well. That issue was busing. So what exactly was busing? Well, busing was an attempt to achieve racial integration in schools by sending students to school districts that weren't their own. Therefore, black children would be sent to predominantly white schools and vice versa. While many voters nationwide actually supported school desegregation, even more voters opposed the busing initiatives that were out to achieve racial balance. In a 1971 Gallup poll, 76% of Americans opposed the busing concept, with 79% of white voters nationwide being against it, and black voters also opposing it, but by a much closer margin of 47% to 45%. As the Cincinnati Enquirer's editor, Brady Black, stated, forced busing, which the Gallup poll published in November already had shown as support by only 18% and opposed by 76% nationally, was like a loaded gun in Governor Wallace's hand. Yeah, I think Wallace wished he would have had that loaded pistol in his hand a few months later. Too soon? Okay, anyway, the issue of busing growing in national importance became the rallying cry for the Wallace campaign. It's now at this point of the video where we ask if Wallace could have won the Democratic nomination or not. Before we get into the actual primaries and conventions themselves, we first need to look at something called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. After the hectic 1968 Democratic convention, where party bosses and favorite sons dominated who won the nomination, there were rule changes that sought to connect the popular support to pledged delegates. Why? Well, in 1968, Hubert Humphrey easily won the nomination for president, even though he only gained 2% of the vote in the Democratic primaries. Yeah, the system was pretty flawed. While the McGovern-Fraser Commission did a lot to lessen control of state delegations by party bosses at the Democratic National Convention itself, some states could still have party bosses control the process. For example, if the national delegates were selected through a statewide convention, not based on the primary votes, the party bosses could still influence the delegate counts by highly influencing who were delegates at the state conventions. And even if primaries affected delegate selection, it was not uniform. In Massachusetts, the Democratic Party primary was still a winner-take-all system, as it was in 1968. In the state of Illinois, the primary elected the delegates themselves and not the candidates who were the representatives of the delegates. However, the Illinois delegation would eventually be challenged and thrown out of the 1972 convention because it hadn't adhered to the rules regarding diversity that was laid out in the McGovern-Fraser Commission. The main point here is that the system was improving, but it still had a number of problems. Now, let's start looking at the primaries themselves. In the early primaries, Wallace really didn't expect to contest them. He wasn't expecting to do well in Arizona or Iowa, and the Mississippi State Convention, which had 25 uncommitted delegates, would probably easily go to Wallace at the convention. Therefore, in some of the early Gallup polls, Wallace wasn't even included. Instead, he decided to make his first stand in Florida. This stand in Florida might have been Wallace's first big mistake in capturing the Democratic nomination. One thing that the McGovern-Fraser recommendations changed was that any candidate for the Democratic nomination needed to treat the nominating process as a national project. Having a nationwide campaign was the new way to win the nomination. Cherry-picking states and running up totals in those states was the old way to win. This just didn't jibe with how the process now worked. Still, Wallace did win the Florida primary on March 14th with 42% of the vote, giving him the first pledged delegates to the convention for his campaign. Even with this victory, Wallace wasn't seeing much support nationally. In a Gallup poll conducted on April 3rd, Wallace was a strong third, taking 17%, but Hubert Humphrey netted 31%, with Ed Muskie getting 22%. John Lindsay and George McGovern were both tied at 5% each. So yeah, with McGovern getting 5%, so much for early polls. The same poll, for the first time, also looked at the possible Nixon-Wallace matchup and not having Wallace as a third-party candidate, in which Nixon absolutely trounces Wallace 69% to 23%. That would have been the biggest one-sided victory since James Monroe in 1820, who was basically unopposed. Yeah, this would have been a historic loss of historic proportions. Now we come to the April 4th primary in Wisconsin, and in previous elections, Wallace had performed quite well, winning 34% in the 1964 primary and 8% in the 1968 general election, which was higher than most northern states. In this primary, Wallace finished second place with 22% of the vote, finishing behind George McGovern and ahead of Hubert Humphrey. However, because Wallace's vote was too sporadic and spread throughout the state, and that this vote was done by congressional district, Wallace didn't win any delegates. This further shows the problems that the Wallace campaign had. They might have had the votes, but they might not get the delegates. A few weeks later in Pennsylvania, Wallace would win 21% of the vote, which was still impressive, especially for a northern state, but only 2 delegates, compared to Hubert Humphrey's 74 delegates with only 35% of the vote. And in Ohio, Wallace didn't even appear on the ballot. Still, there were some bright spots for the Wallace campaign. He won 41% in Indiana, finishing second, giving him 27 delegates. This further added to Wallace's credibility that he could win or at least do well outside of the South, but still, the South was his base, where he won both the Tennessee and North Carolina primaries with a majority of the vote. But then came Louisiana, and this is where we see the new face of Democratic politics in the South having an impact on Wallace's delegation count. On May 13th, Louisiana held their district conventions, where Wallace only received 3 of the 44 delegates. 16 of the delegates were black delegates, but many of the delegates, 32 in all, remained uncommitted. This was a blow to the campaign, as Louisiana was one of the 5 states that Wallace carried in 1968. After Louisiana came, the May 16th primaries of Maryland and Michigan were next. Up to this time, the big issue was busing, the backbone of the Wallace campaign, and it didn't really have much traction nationally. Besides, the Democratic Party had changed, being more liberal and progressive. Many of those who had opposed busing had actually now kind of moved over to Richard Nixon and to the Republicans, as well as other Republicans waiting in the wings like Ronald Reagan. But in Michigan, with its large union voting bloc that always votes in Democratic primaries, the busing issue was considered more salient than other states. As Democrats went to the polls that day,
Governor Wallace was shot just after he finished a campaign speech at a Laurel, Maryland shopping center about 15 miles from the nation's capital. The police arrested a suspect right away. He was identified as 21-year-old Arthur Bremer of a Milwaukee, Wisconsin address.
Wallace would go on to win both the Maryland and Michigan primaries. In Maryland, where the shooting took place, Wallace secured 39% of the vote and picked up 41 delegates. In Michigan, Wallace won 51% of the vote and picked up 67 delegates. Here is where we could see what might be considered the genesis of the so-called Reagan Democrat, where in Macomb County, Wallace won 69% of the primary vote. However, McGovern picked up 38 delegates with 27% of the vote statewide, and Humphrey picked up 27 delegates with only 16% of the vote. Even though Wallace was shot, many people think that his campaign ended, but it didn't. Wallace never dropped out of the race for the presidency and was a candidate all the way up to the Democratic Convention in Miami. Even though he was in the hospital, his campaign pressed on. Still, the Michigan primary exposed the biggest problem that the Wallace campaign had, which was that they were playing checkers while the McGovern and the Humphrey campaigns were playing chess. The Wallace campaign's mindset was focused on primaries that they knew they could do well in, and using that as their argument as to Wallace's electability. But the Louisiana District Convention showed how weak Wallace was now with rank-and-file Democrats in state politics, especially since many Democratic parties were now integrated. This trend also continued in states like Missouri and Kentucky, two states where he performed well in 1968, but gained no delegates in 1972. Even before the shooting, many in the news expected that Maryland and Michigan would basically be Wallace's last hurrah. An overwhelming majority of the primaries and conventions that followed were more liberal and progressive, and busing didn't really factor into the equation. In addition, many of the remaining primaries, such as Oregon, Rhode Island, South Dakota, and a delegate-rich California, were winner-take-all. Wallace did perform well in New Mexico and did have the most delegates coming out of the state of Texas at their state convention on June 13th. However, whether he had been shot or not, his momentum was expected to stop after Maryland and Michigan anyway. Essentially, the McGovern campaign knew how the nomination rules worked, which was quite obvious since McGovern's name was on the name of the commission's report. But Wallace, as well as Humphrey, didn't know those rules quite well. McGovern knew that he needed to win just enough of the vote to perform well at the convention, and that's exactly what he did. So the reason why Wallace just didn't perform well, and probably wouldn't have performed well, is that he and somewhat Humphrey were just behind the times, and McGovern had a leg up when it came to understanding the new rules as to how to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1972. But for the sake of this video, let's say that George Wallace had won the nomination. Would he have actually been able to win the presidential election against Richard Nixon? Well, that's highly unlikely. Wallace was never put in another Gallup poll after the April poll, in which showed him getting his ass handed to him by Richard Nixon. In the Electoral College, Wallace might have been able to pick up a few southern states that he picked up in 1968, giving him a performance better than McGovern, though he would have likely have lost Massachusetts and even possibly the District of Columbia. Still, no matter who the Democratic nominee was, Nixon had a comfortable lead in the polls, and that was even including George Wallace as a third-party candidate or not. At the end of the day, Arthur Bremer's bullets didn't likely change the outcome of the Democratic nomination for president. Yes, most Americans might have agreed with Wallace on busing, but there were other issues as well. The Vietnam War was still raging, which was a cornerstone of McGovern's campaign. But the McGovern campaign knew what they were doing when it came to delegate count and how to control the convention. Honestly, the 1972 Democratic Convention showed just how much McGovern's stranglehold was on the Democratic Party, with McGovern and his delegates rejecting challenges to his delegates, even if it was argued that their election went against the spirit of the recommendations of the commission that he headed. Yeah, the 72 convention, again, a whole nother video for a whole nother day. But I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. If you did like this video, please like it, comment, and subscribe. And if you would like to join my Patreon, there's a link down below in the description. Have a nice day and see you all soon.